What might be an important point made by J.R. White was that whenever they changed the view between the Earth and the interior of the capsule, it always blacks out during the changeover. You never see the direct camera pan from the interior capsule view of the Earth and vice versa. This could be because they needed to turn off the interior lights while they staged the Earth view, or simply just to adjust the focus of the camera. J.R. also notes that while the audio is continuous, the video is not. It appears as though the video is edited and portions omitted, even though the spacecraft film's DVD is supposedly one full mission obtained from NASA. The implication to this is that the astronauts are in low Earth orbit and pre-recorded video is being broadcast by NASA. There seems to be no question that whichever version of events you choose to accept, these transmissions were clearly faked. Video of lunar module landing on the moon. A 16mm data acquisition camera DAC was fitted into the capsule so that it had a good view out of the lunar module pilot's window, perfect for capturing the landing action. The landing video for Apollo 14 is shown in the annotated NASA video from the Apollo Lunar Lander Journal. Let's watch this as I will explain what is happening. The approach part of the landing video used a camera tracking over a model similar to that used in the astronaut's training simulator. If you look closely at time 1436, you can just about make out the striation lines of the model. I took the screenshot from the video and added 2 lines to show the direction of the striations. The model maker made up accurate scale models from photographs taken of the lunar surface by the lunar orbiter, which flew parallel paths across the lunar surface on each orbit. The only reference the model maker had was these photographs on parallel paths, and clearly he followed them exactly to ensure accuracy. This resulted in discernible parallel lines across the model surface. Following the model sequence, a revolving mat was supplied to give the impression of sand being blown out by the rocket engine. This was useful as it allowed the model sequence to be dissolved into the actual stage set on which the astronauts performed. Note one interesting point, that the object at the center top of the image changes shape from round to square after the dissolve and the model to the full-size stage set. This abbreviation was clearly a simple oversight and is the only mission on which this happened. This aberration was clearly a simple oversight and it is the only mission on which this happened. If you think about what they were doing, then it is quite remarkable that they were able to make this transition from a model to a full-sized stage set with such convincing accuracy. It has clearly proved very difficult to always match up persuasively the detail between the model and the full set. However, the transition from model to stage set was not always perfect and often contained some anomalies. Here we see another one from the same Apollo 14 video. The crater shadows in the model prior to the dissolve are much deeper than the final stage set version, presumably because they got the sun angle not quite the same. You need to watch very closely to see this subtle difference. I have taken 2 screenshots which perhaps shows the difference slightly better. One important thing to note is that for the moon landings, Apollo 11 did not use this transition from a model to the full-scale set technique. It is only with Apollo 14 that they employed this technique with any degree of success, but even then we have seen it is not perfect the first time they tried it. For all later Apollo missions, they used a longer time sequence of the sand mat, so any transition was not so clearly discernible. Perhaps this was a conscious decision to eliminate this transition problem. TV pictures from the moon. The best evidence to convince people that man had really landed on the moon would be live TV transmissions and the lunar surface to capture the full glory of the action, and this is what NASA X set out to produce. NASA X faced one big problem: how to produce live television footage of men on the moon operating in the much reduced moon gravity. Clearly, the video needed to be recorded and broadcast live to convince the world that what they were witnessing as it happened was really true. Of course, nobody would detect whether the TV signals coming into mission control were live or even were actually coming from the moon. One needs to realize that one of the most crucial parts of the hoax was to fool the operatives in mission control as well. So, how could they do this? We can now introduce our main characters in the story and see how they solved this problem. Frederick Ordway was an American space scientist and author of visionary books on spaceflight. In 1965, he was a top official at NASA, working closely with the rocket scientist Wernher von Braun. Arthur C. Clarke, who was a well-known British science fiction writer, was also an advisor to NASA and, as such, was well connected with Ordway. At the time, Stanley Kubrick was an up-and-coming film producer and had achieved industry recognition in his direction of the Kirk Douglas movie Spartacus. The problem to be solved was how could they produce convincing footage of men walking in a reduced gravity on the moon. The idea emerged of making a movie as a trial run for NASA's X-Fakery. I believe that in 1962, Arthur C. Clarke contacted Stanley Kubrick, a well-known film director, to discuss the possibility of making a sci-fi movie which would enable them to at least test out the feasibility of producing convincing film footage of men walking on the moon. The movie was to be 2001: A Space Odyssey, supposedly financed by the American studio Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer to the tune of US $10 million. I find this rather strange that a major studio would bankroll a movie for which there was yet no script. Clarke and Kubrick could write the script as the film developed, although it was loosely based on Clarke's book, The Sentinel. I suggest that the financing of this movie was most probably greatly influenced by NASA X, as it is doubtful that a major studio would be willing to put up US $10 million for a movie that had no established storyline. For NASA X, $10 million would be a drop in the ocean given an extremely large NASA budget. The advantage of The Sentinel as the basis of the movie was that it involved the moon and offered the perfect test bed for simulating moon scenes that NASA X needed to test. As it transpired, the movie was a great box office success and grossed about $180 million at the box office. Arthur C. Clarke and Frederick Ordway were frequent visitors to the Shepperton studio where the movie was to be made. NASA gave Kubrick access to all of their available data and the moon's topography, which included the satellite photography and later the large-scale models that NASA had created for astronaut training and the selection of suitable landing sites for the Apollo missions. These models were later used as part of the fakery using small camera technology, which had been developed by John Dykstra, who at the time was a little-known American special effects artist who achieved fame much later for his work on the movie Star Wars. The resultant movie, 2001: A Space Odyssey, was started in 1963 and completed in 1968. It used the front screen projection technique to create the illusion of a large moon landscape, which is exactly what NASA X required. It was a tremendous success, being acclaimed as the best sci-fi movie of all time. Perhaps more importantly, it convinced NASA X that they could fabricate the moon landings. A very interesting discussion is shown on the video from www. Rich Planet TV, in which the presenter, Richard Hall, interviews Carl James. Carl James reveals many pieces of the circumstantial evidence which seems to point to Kubrick's possible involvement. It is abundantly clear that the Apollo moon videos were taken on a stage set as witnessed by the telltale evidence of front screen projection that we have discussed in Chapter 6. The fakery is in this respect rather poor, as the Kubrick horizontal is so clearly visible in almost every Apollo moon video. It always surprises me how anyone can view these kind of videos of the lunar scape and be convinced that they were actually taken on the moon. I think the only explanation is that they do not study the images in detail and overlook the very obvious Kubrick horizontal. This is acceptable for an average person who may not look too closely at the videos or photographs or even contemplate that elements within NASA could have conducted such a massive hoax. I would count myself in this group for 48 years in which I accepted what NASA told us. However, the pro-NASA fanboys and girls are in the mainstream well-educated science area who have now supposedly studied the subject in considerable detail. How could they be so easily conned into accepting the NASA evidence, or are there other financial factors involved? Some rocks brought back from the moon? Proving that the rocks came from the moon is something of a paradox. If the rocks are totally unique and therefore unknown, then it is not possible to state with any confidence that they came from the moon. The best that the geologists can do is to infer that they seem likely to be from the moon, but this is not proof. No doubt their judgment is somewhat influenced by the fact that NASA told them that the rocks were brought back from the moon by the Apollo astronauts. Rocks from the moon do exist lying around on all parts of the Earth, so one has to search them out. We have already discussed in Chapter 4 the NASA field trip to Antarctica to collect moon rocks, so it doesn't take much imagination to assume that the rocks collected were subsequently altered to fake the moon rocks supposedly from the moon. You just need to remove the traces of the burnt crust caused by the fiery re-entry through the Earth's atmosphere, and then use lasers to add the micrometeorite zap craters that would have been created on the moon. This would be sufficient to fool the geologists, but really, who would be any wiser? Photographs of astronauts on the moon. Producing photographs of astronauts on the moon is a relatively simple task, and NASA did it to perfection, almost too perfect to be convincing. Many of the photographs of the Apollo astronauts on the moon are so perfectly focused, so perfectly framed, and are of a standard that would be envied by many semi-professional photographers. I consider these photographs to be one of the weakest in the NASA evidence. Firstly, we need to consider the cameras supposedly used by the astronauts on the moon to understand why perhaps the NASA photographs are considered to be too perfect to be believable. The cameras supplied were made by the company of Victor Hasselblad AB, which is a Swedish manufacturer, and were constructed to NASA specifications. Several different types of cameras were taken to the moon to suit the type of still photography and video tasks. I will not go into detail concerning the technological aspects of these cameras, as I am not a photographer and I probably wouldn't understand what I am saying. For any budding or even expert photographers, you can see the full details in the NASA documentation. There are one or two aspects of the cameras that are claimed to have been used on the surface of the moon which differ from what you might expect and need to be highlighted so you can fully understand some of what follows. The astronauts needed to wear special spacesuits to be able to survive in the hostile climate while bobbing around on the surface of the moon. They also needed to have both hands free to carry out specific tasks related to planned scientific experiments. The camera was therefore fixed hands-free into a special retainer attached on the astronaut's chest, although it could be unclipped and handheld if necessary. These factors had three major consequences for photography on the moon in the way that cameras could be operated. Firstly, the astronauts' fishbowl helmets made it impossible for them to look down into the viewfinder to frame the shot and adjust the focus, so NASA did away with the viewfinder, and it would only have added weight and would not have served any useful purpose. Secondly, the other consequences of not being able to look down at the camera meant that the astronauts could not see any buttons on the camera, so that the buttons to operate the camera were placed underneath at the front of the camera. Thirdly, the spacesuits had to be pressurized with about 5 psi, otherwise the astronauts' blood would boil and they would turn into jelly and quickly die. The pressurized gloves meant that this was very difficult to have fine touch, so the buttons on the camera were made extra large. Imagine typing your next email while wearing heavy-duty gardening gloves and you will get the idea. Hasselblad made all of these design adjustments to their standard 500 EL camera design. The Hasselblad cameras had an electric motor which largely automated the picture-taking process. The astronauts needed only to set the distance, lens aperture, focus, and shutter speed. I say only, but wearing gardening gloves and with your head in a fishbowl is not such an easy task. Once the release button was pressed, the camera exposed the film, wound on to the next frame, and tensioned the shutter. The final design adjustment to the Hasselblad camera was the fitting of the Resua plate. The Resua plate was made of glass and was fitted to the back of the camera body extremely close to the film plane. The plate was then engraved with a number of crosshairs to form a grid. The intersections were 10 millimeters apart and accurately calibrated to a tolerance of 0.002 millimeters. Except for the larger central cross, each of the four arms on each cross was 1 millimeter long and 0.02 millimeters wide. The crosses are recorded on every exposed frame, supposedly providing a means of determining angular distances between objects in the field of view. The importance of the Resua plate in our discussions is that it enables us to judge just how well the photograph was centered due to the large crosshairs centered on the Resua plate. The skeptic Marcus Allen has often commented on the extremely high quality of some of these photographs taken by Neil Armstrong just minutes after arriving on the moon. In a presentation he made at the 5th British Exopolitics Expo held at the University of Huddersfield on September 28, 2013, he discussed this photography. Over the 6 Apollo moon missions, NASA state that the astronauts took a total of about 6,000 photographs on the moon. Perhaps it is a mathematician creeping out of me, but I do have a tendency when I see numbers to have an urge to want to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. So I got to thinking, 6,000 photographs, now this is a very large number. How long were they walking about taking photographs while they were on the moon? Well, it turns out to be a total of just over 80 hours on the 6 missions. No doubt you will see where this is going. So, calculator in hand, I get 75 photos per hour, which is 6,000 divided by 80. So it seems that they took only one photograph every 48 seconds while on EVAs. That is a rather astonishing act of photography. I must say that I am quite surprised at these numbers, given that many of these photographs were taken at different locations, distances apart, or some walking or driving was involved, which limited the time to take the photographs. I realized in later missions, Apollo 15, 16, and 17, that some photographs were obtained from the camera on the lunar rover, but still, the mind boggles at the number of photographs allegedly taken on the moon. While on the surface, the crew took 1,151 photographs with the Hasselblad cameras. Major photographic tasks were to record surface activities and document sample retrieval. So, we have 1,151 photographs taken by the 2 crew in EVAs lasting 19 hours. That was 61 photographs every hour, or 1 photograph every 59 seconds. Note that these 1,151 photographs were, according to the NASA statement above, were taken only with the Hasselblad camera, so does not include any photographs taken by the lunar rover camera. If you are at all inclined, take a look at this video which shows the compelling first EVA of Apollo 15. Did you see any astronaut taking a photograph? No, you didn't? So, when were they supposedly taking a photograph every minute? Something is seriously wrong here, and it simply reveals the fakery. When I view all of the videos of the Apollo astronauts walking on the moon, I see very few photographs being taken. I cannot explain why NASA has produced such a large number of photographs, but I will leave that for you to ponder. Was NASA just overexcited about producing moon photographs and did not realize the issue that they were creating? Evidence of leaving retroreflectors. The retroreflector saga was a ploy by NASA to act as a proof that Apollo astronauts did in fact land on the moon. They show clear video of the retroreflectors being accurately placed by the astronauts. We have already discussed the retroreflector story in Chapter 11 and conclude that it is based on a flawed science. The retroreflector only accounts for 0.000000967% of the area covered by the diverged laser beam when it reaches the moon, and only 0.000000000000714% by the time it gets back to the retrieving telescope on Earth. Talk about finding the proverbial needle in a haystack. If the retroreflector is present in the area illuminated by the laser, it will only receive a minuscule part of the laser signal, and it cannot send back more than it received. This means that the retroreflectors of Apollo are too small to be really effective at such a large distance. The fact that the system does not give an instantaneous result for one fire of the laser, but has to be repeated over many hours while both the sun and the moon are in constant relative motion, is just nonsense. What they think they are measuring to an accuracy of 3 millimeters is puzzling. NASA has intended that the subsequent use of the retroreflector to bounce signals off of the moon would be incontestable evidence of man stepping on the moon and placing the retroreflectors there. Unfortunately, on closer examination, this story is imperfect and does not stand the scrutiny of the scientific evidence. Signals were being successfully bounced off the moon many years before the Apollo project. Perhaps NASA didn't know about the work of MIT in 1961, or simply hoped that it would not be revealed. Videos of ascent stage blasting off the moon. If you have not seen the video of the ascent stage of the lunar module lifting off from the moon, then take a look now at this Apollo 17 leaving the moon. It is a surprisingly poor attempt at fakery. It looks like a model being pulled up on a string, or even worse, it does not exhibit the proper acceleration profile for a rocket taking off when the first phase is slow as the rocket initially overcomes gravity. The NASA X model lunar lander just pops up like magic. You can now view the other Apollo missions blast-offs in these videos, Apollo 15 and Apollo 16. If you are feeling concerned that they left a cameraman on the moon, then I can tell you right now that these videos were taken by the camera on the lunar rover, which was controlled by NASA on Earth, albeit with a signal delay, so the camera operator needed to act ahead of time. For both Apollo 16 and 17, the camera on the lunar rover was panned to follow the rising spacecraft. On Apollo 15, the camera does not pan upwards to follow the spacecraft. NASA state that this was due to a technical problem. Now, what did we see in these supposed departures from the moon? Well, we certainly saw a lot of flying debris in the form of colored fragments shooting out when the explosive bolts are blown and the guillotine knives are used to sever the umbilical cables. These bolts are used to hold together the ascent stage and the descent stages. In all three videos, there is a small triangular plume positioned on the descent stage which stays visible for less than half a second but does not follow the spacecraft upwards. There appears to be no plume extending below the spacecraft as it rises. Finally, we see that the rocket blastoff looks rather unnatural. I'm no rocket scientist, but it does appear as though the ascent stage just pops up without any sign of the first pause which one would expect, as it would initially struggle to overcome lunar gravity. We will now let Jarrah White outline the problem as he sees it. In Jarrah's view, the claim by the pro-NASA believers that the propellants used in the ascent stage rocket would not give rise to a visible plume is not true, and he compares this video to video footage from the Apollo 9 mission. I think that you need to be a staunch pro-NASA believer to watch these liftoffs from the moon and be convinced that you are watching some real event rather than some clumsily made model attempt to fake it. Video capsule landing on its return to Earth. In some of the NASA videos of the capsule retrieval at sea, we may have been looking at a real event or a capsule that had just been unceremoniously dropped out of an aircraft. Either way, that part of the fakery was relatively easy. If you can convincingly devise all of these elements, then you may be able to fake the moon landings. Unfortunately, NASA was not able to do that without leaving many clues that expose the fakery. Simulation of gravity. When you think about what the difference is between the Earth and the Moon, you come up with two main elements. Firstly, the Moon has a hostile climate with extremes of fluctuating temperatures, high levels of radiation, and no atmosphere to sustain life. Secondly, it has a much lower gravitational force compared with the Earth. The simulation of the astronauts coping with no atmosphere is easily solved with a fancy-looking spacesuit, supposedly with adequate radiation protection, but actually made of sewn-together layers of nylon, unbelievably with zips. Gravity is a much greater challenge. In theory, you could train the astronauts in French mime, like the famous Marcel Marceau, so that they could pretend lower gravity in their movements. This may be less comical than what NASA actually did. The best solution, and the one adopted by NASA, was actually to simulate the moon's lesser gravitational force using slow-motion photography and harness supports for the astronauts to relieve them from up to 83% of their Earth weight. Astronauts were trained on Earth using special harnesses which simulated lesser gravitational force on the moon. There are several videos of these training exercises produced by NASA in 1968. Here you can see some of the ingeniously complicated contraptions devised in order to simulate moon gravity. Note that somehow they state that they had managed to develop simulated lunar soil. How they managed this, I don't know, given that they had nothing to compare it with. The training videos also showed astronauts using pressurized and unpressurized suits. The difference between the unpressurized suit and the pressurized suit are vast, and the pressurized suit clearly inhibits the astronauts' movement, particularly at the joints. It is also clear that in the simulated lunar gravity condition that the astronauts had problems in obtaining friction at their feet due to the fact that up to 83.3% of their weight was taken up by the counterbalance wire. The extraordinary ability of the astronauts shown in the training videos to perform quite athletic movements, jumping very high and even performing high somersaults with very little apparent effort. These athletic performances were never seen in the actual Apollo moon footage. Astronauts on wires. In the end, NASA opted for a single wire attached between the backpack and the astronaut's body, probably in a harness around the astronaut's waist and chest. In one photo, I have found that the astronauts actually were attached to a single cable which was attached to a giant helium-filled balloon. The wire used was probably a braided black metal monofilament less than 5 millimeters diameter, so that it was not visible to the Apollo camera, but on some rare occasions it could be detected. In addition to the wire support, NASA also used various slow-motion techniques to simulate the gravity of falling objects. The single suspension wire also had negative effects in that the astronauts exhibit some strange movements due to their reliance on the wire support. In many cases, the astronauts appear to stumble and then regain their balance. Some of the sequences appear to be quite odd, but this is simply because the astronaut is partially suspended by the single wire. The single wire support also gave the astronauts a tendency to spin and then correct themselves. The presence of the wire caused the astronauts to lean on it for support and then to have sudden spasms induced by the wire going slack, causing a full body jerk to regain balance. Their attempts to regain control of their balance is affected by the pull of the wires, and so many times they appear to undergo spasms in their movement, which looks quite unnatural. However, this is a natural reaction of the human balance system, and we all exhibit these strange spasms if we feel that we are about to lose balance. If you don't believe me, try now to lean over backwards and you will see what I mean. Many unnatural physical movements of the astronauts are often seen in the Apollo footage. The backpack can be often seen to be pulled back as the astronaut bends forward. Also, when the astronaut jumps, it appears that the backpack rises first, which we would not expect to see. You would expect to see that the head of the astronaut would rise first, and then the backpack would get pulled up afterwards by the astronaut's body. These instances are very common if you watch very closely to the footage of the astronauts moving. For example, take a look at these sequences in the video above. You will see astronauts training with wire harnesses. Note also the unnecessary throwing of all manner of objects by the astronauts. I say unnecessary, but this was an important part of the NASA ploy to present ample opportunity for you to calculate the gravitational force and hence prove it was really filmed on the moon. You can also see many examples of how their suspension wire was also used to jerk up the astronaut who had fallen. The original video was filmed in slow motion at 144 frames per second. An optical printer was then used to select the frames required to build the slow motion effect, taking into account the types of action on the set. This BBC Horizon video from 1985 shows how the optical printer is used in filmmaking. Although this video shows the more advanced green screen method and not the front screen projection method used for superimposing black screen images, this technique is used in the optical printer and is very similar. Note that VFX is just shorthand for visual effects. The suspension wire had counterbalance for the specific astronaut's weight, but the amount of weight taken off the astronaut also depended on the final video frame per second to be used as follows. 1. 83.3% simulated lunar gravity requires 24 frames per second. 2. 44.6% simulated lunar gravity requires 44 frames per second. 3. 39% simulated lunar gravity requires 48 frames per second. And finally, 0% simulated lunar gravity requires 59 frames per second. This was quite a clever device for the fakers to cover the deceit. Most skeptics have suggested that the video was simply slowed down by some factor to create the simulated moon gravity. This would have led to the fakery being easily discovered by simply speeding up the video by some factor. Several skeptics have tried this, but the results are never totally convincing. The reason for this is that the frame rate is constantly changing, so instead of you watching one clip at a specific frame rate, you are in effect watching several shorter clips at different frame rates but cleverly stitched together. The frame rate changes are quite subtle, usually occurring as the astronaut jumps or performs some other distracting activity. The use of different frame rates was quite ingenious. It was used extensively to falsely add depth to the scenes by tricking the eye that the stage set was larger than it was. They did this by changing the amount of slow motion used depending on what was happening on the set. The closer the astronaut was to the camera, then the amount of slow motion was much reduced. Particularly when the astronauts were manipulating objects very close to the camera, then the slow motion was perhaps only 10%. As the astronaut moves further away from the camera, then the amount of slow motion is increased in stages. This actually gave the illusion that the stage set was much deeper than it actually was, at the time it takes the astronaut to move away is falsely increased. A good example of this is shown in this short clip extracted from the anonymous make-believe smoke and mirrors video. Watch carefully, and at the elapsed time of 5 seconds, you can clearly see the speed change as the astronaut slows down unnaturally. This is a good example of the frame speed change as more slow motion is added the further away the astronaut moves from the camera. Note that this revealing video has been removed from the NASA archive and is no longer available. Note that it has been replaced by a newer version in real player format. Interestingly, the clear evidence of the frame speed change has been eliminated. This is just another example of NASA editing the evidence that clearly reveals the techniques of the fakery. In total, at least 7 different frame extraction sequences can be detected which were used by NASA X. These can be used to calculate different frame adjustment factors needed to remove the slow motion from the NASA footage. The basic equation is 24 frames per second over slow motion frames, which equals frame length adjustment factor.